Hi, everybody. Today is Tuesday, September 16th, 2025, and our friend John Helmer is back with us. Welcome back, John.
Thank you for having me, Nima. Good to be back.
Please subscribe and hit like button to help us reaching more people. John, what has happened in the United States with the assassination of Charlie Kirk? And he
Hmm.
was somehow, everybody was trying to picture him the way that would benefit them. But
Yes.
when you look at Charlie Kirk and the conflict between the United States and Russia, you've mentioned something different from what we've seen so far. Who was Charlie Kirk for Donald Trump, to Donald Trump, and the ongoing conflict between the United States and Russia?
Um, it's a very good question, Nima, and we're going to try and break some new ground. But let me start by pointing out to people that I've been the target of an assassination attempt. I survived because I was rescued by the Moscow police, and the gunmen were arrested and confessed to the entire story. You can read that story in the book that's on the bottom of the screen. So I know what being the target of an assassination is like. And then I also know how the context follows of interpreting whatever had happened to me from the point of view of all sorts of people with an interest in advancing their own views, or wishing I was dead, or being vaguely happy that I survived, and what have you. So context after the death is everything. We can begin by regretting the death of the man, but we have to then understand the context of the man's employment. He was a paid propagandist for the Trump administration, and he said so repeatedly. In fact, one of the few consistencies in Kirk's regular expressions of opinion and then changes of mind, the only, possibly only consistency is what he termed his 100% support for Donald Trump. So let's look at the context in the US, as I understand it, as the evidence becomes clear. And then the context in Russia, where there have been some unusual political reactions to Kirk's assassination, which reflect Kremlin politics in exactly the way you've just expressed it. The Kremlin politics regarding the negotiations with Trump and the end or the settlement or the prosecution of the Ukraine war. So first of all, let's look at the US context for what Kirk was doing and how he's understood. The important thing to emphasize, first of all, is that young voters for Trump last year have been deserting him in far greater numbers and percentages than any other age group. What you do in the White House is you count votes all the time, and you're preoccupied with keeping power and advancing power, not only day by day and in the relation between the White House and the Congress, but ultimately for the midterms, which will decide whether you have a Congress supporting you or not, and then the presidential succession, or, as it's possible, Trump's re-election if he succeeds in achieving and driving himself into succession that's presently constitutionally impossible. So when young voters are losing faith in Trump, it was Kirk's job to rally them and remobilize young voters. That was his job. That's what he thought he was doing. At the same time, you have to look at the way in which his death is being magnified, celebrated by the Trump central administrator, Stephen Miller, the deputy chief of staff, who supervises the two important things: the social media that Trump produces, some of which is written by Miller. You can see which tweets Miller has been involved in. And second, he supervises the militarization, the homeland security operations, which are primarily aimed, first, at boosting the MAGA constituency of all ages, and second, making sure that the centers of Democratic Party voting can be controlled by military and police means, in other words, by repression, going into next year's election and possibly going into 2028. Militarization is what Stephen Miller represents in the domestic context. And let me read you what he said about Kirk's assassination. And it's a manifesto, if you like, of Kirk as a propagandist for Trump values. He starts, this is Stephen Miller's tweet of September 11. There's an ideology that has been steadily growing in this country, I'm reading it, which hates everything that's good, righteous, and beautiful, and celebrates everything that is warped, twisted, and depraved. It's an ideology at war with family and nature. It's envious, malicious, and soulless. It's an ideology that looks upon the perfect family with bitter rage, and goes on. We see the workings of this ideology in every posting online cheering the evil assassination that cruelly robbed this nation of one of its greatest men. The fate of millions depends upon the defeat of this wicked ideology. The fate of our children, our society, our civilization hinges on it. Now we devote ourselves with love and unyielding determination of finishing the indispensable work to which Charlie bravely devoted his life. Now, that has reminders of two things. One is mobilization of the base, especially the young voters, to a war, he uses that term, war, against an evil ideology. Now, he doesn't call them radical left, or he doesn't call them Democrats, but others do, including President Trump himself. The last time something like this was attempted as part of a militarization, a domestic mobilization against an evil ideology, was the Horst Wessel song. Horst Wessel was a brown shirt, a stormtrooper for the SA in the rise of the Nazi Party. He, in 1929 in Germany, he wrote a song, a hymn against the Reds and against the evil ideology afflicting Germany. He was shot and ultimately died during a dispute over unpaid rent in 1930. And his death became celebrated, particularly by Goebbels, as a propaganda weapon against the left, against the evil ideology consuming Germany. And the Horst Wessel song became an anthem of first of the Nazi Party and then of Nazi Germany until they were defeated in 1945. This, how to say, exploitation as propaganda of a propagandist has happened before. And when you see the way in which Miller and others are using the death as a weapon against their political enemies, you have to be concerned about the comparison with Nazi Germany. It's not just Miller in the White House. For example, Sebastian Gorka, who is a Hungarian British American individual with a senior post in the National Security Council, a committed warfighter against Russia, as is Miller, has celebrated the successor to Kirk in this propaganda operation to keep young people, let's say between 18 and 25 or 30, voting for Trump. Gorka has said, and I'm looking at his tweet, bravo to Ben Shapiro. This was a partner, a committed partner and committed Zionist in the Kirk operation, for picking up Charlie Kirk's Bloody Mike and continue his work across American campuses. Don't care if it's in politics, says Gorka. This Catholic thinks you're a mensch, Ben. A mensch being the Yiddish for a gentleman, a great man. In other words, there is pervasive support for militarizing the domestic context in the United States to keep power for the Trump regime. That's the context in the US, and it has implications for all the wars the US is presently fighting, including the war against Russia. It's not correct that Kirk was, in fact, let's say, a supporter of the settlement of the war in Russia. What is correct is that he took his instructions from Miller and from Trump. He followed what he believed was their line. He's also, it should be understood, in relation to a lot of the speculation about who was benefited from his death abroad, the so-called Israel did it theory. It has to be understood that Kirk was being used and enjoyed being used and was rewarded for being used in multiplying the variety of views the Trump administration wanted to get out, where there was ambiguity. Was he pro-Israel or pro-Netanyahu or anti-Israel or anti-Netanyahu? All of the speculation of that kind fails to understand that this man was a paid professional propagandist with a particular mission. And one of those missions was deception, misinformation, disinformation, letting out bits of truth that might not be believed in the context in which he put them. That's the US context. Now let's look at the Russian context, which is extraordinary and simply not discussed outside of Russia. On the one hand, you have a very significant Kremlin figure, Kirill Dmitriev. Kirill Dmitriev's President Putin's negotiator with the United States for business deals to encourage the American companies, encourage people like Stephen Witkoff and Howard Lutnick and Scott Bessent and Stephen Feinberg at the Pentagon, the policy makers making Trump's policy, to persuade them of the big rewards if they go soft on sanctions and they let Russia finish the war on Russian terms. What did Kirill Dmitriev rush to say in social media? Pray for Charlie, he said. Pray for Charlie. The voices of the light will not be silenced. Now, why does a Kremlin official say things like that about a paid propagandist who's often on in favor of putting more pressure on Putin, in favor of giving less arms to the Ukraine? Why does he say it? He said more. He said publicly, so he intends this politically. Kirill Dmitriev says this death has important implications not only in the United States, but outside of the United States. What sort of political message, in what context is he saying it? Well, let me go to what the Foreign Ministry has said, and I'm shuffling papers, so pardon me for while I do this, to get Maria Zakharova, the Foreign Ministry spokesman's words exactly right. What she said was, she was asked at a briefing last week Yesterday, you, Ms. Zakharova, provided a comment on the assassination of the conservative activist Charlie Kirk. Do you have an update? Now, the first thing Zakharova said was, we cannot and we will not draw any conclusions before the suspect or the people involved in this crime are found and taken into custody. She's making a perfectly reasonable statement. We don't really know what happened. And this isn't the time in this program to discuss the evidence collected. What the Russian side is saying, we're not going to get into speculation about that. On the other hand, Zakharova is saying Charlie Kirk's assassinations sparked unprecedented exultation among the Kiev regime supporters. The Ukrainian social media are jubilant. He then goes into an analysis, not of Kirk, not of what he did, not of what he said, not of what he represented, but what the Ukrainian side celebrated in the perception that Kirk was anti-Ukrainian in the current negotiations. Then she ends. This is Zahara. This is the foreign ministry officially saying the reaction to this tragedy has become yet another manifestation of the deeply rooted in the ultra-liberal West, the perception of violence and terror as acceptable means to crack down on dissent. All of that's reasonable, neutral, and it's completely different from Dmitriev. It's avoiding the discussion of Kirk as such and focusing on what the Kiev regime has said. Now, former President Dmitry Medvedev issued a small tweet, and I'm looking for it in my papers. What he said, Medvedev said, was political crimes and assassinations have been carried out lately by a variety of left-wing liberal scum who support Banderite Kiev. Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, Kirk. Who's next? Maybe it's time for the MAGA team to realize that by supporting the Ukraine, they're supporting murderers. That's also relatively neutral towards the context we've just depicted in the United States in a way that Dmitriev was not. Then you get people like Pavel Durov, the owner of Telegram, who wants to advertise Telegram and himself. He says Charlie Kirk's murder threatens freedom of speech around the world. That's an ad for the Telegram. It's an ad for Durov in his conflict with France. He wants to represent himself and Russia's Telegram as freedom of speech. We can argue about whether that's true or not. He's promoting himself. Then Alexander Dugin is a well-known Russian nationalist, Orthodox Christian philosopher in Russia, and he wanted to celebrate Kirk by noting that his assassination date coincides with the Orthodox celebration of the beheading of John the Baptist. And he wants to depict, I won't bother wasting time reading what Dugin has said, as a celebration of traditional values. In other words, projection that Kirk represents in Russia the kind of traditional values that Russia is defending on the Ukraine battlefield. And then there's another voice, Fyodor Lukyanov, who runs a major foreign policy think tank in Moscow, who said, let the ideological war, the holy ideology war now begins. Well, I don't know where Lukyanov was in 1917 or in 1939 or in 1941 or in 45, on and on. The ideology war against Russia is not new. It's hard to believe that he considers that Kirk represents an ideological, a beginning of an ideological war. So what am I trying to sum up? You have a political context in Moscow in which there are pro-American groups trying to persuade Putin to make the concessions that would end the war and return to business as usual. Dmitriev represents that line. Therefore, he's positioned the death of Kirk as an example of first his support for that Republican opportunity, the Trump opportunity to make peace, and makes a mockery of what Russians do understand, the general staff, the intelligence services, the foreign ministry, as the underlying drivers of Trump's war-making policies, including war-making against Russia throughout Europe.
John, you've mentioned what Medvedev tweeted, and it's amazing to me that he puts Fitzo together with Charlie Kirk, and because Fitzo is a left-wing president, he's not right-wing, and he says that he puts the blame on the left-wing one. Liberal lefties want to assassinate Fitzo. In today's, when you look at Europe, look at the United States today, who's left, who's right, John? Because we have some traditional definitions for these words, but that doesn't mean anything today. You don't know. You see, look at Germany today. AfD, somehow they have the same sort of policy, and Sarah Wagenknecht when it comes to Russia. They're merging to each other in terms of the foreign policy. One of the main issues with the foreign policy of Germany, and it's how do you find the situation that Donald Trump, after the assassination, he came out saying that these are radical left wing, people who are trying to assassinate us and all of that. Is there any solid reason for us to divide people into left and right, or there is no definition of these two terms today?
Again, you put it exactly right. But in each country that you covered, we've just spoken of, left and right mean different things. In Greece, where there was a civil war, in Spain, where there was a civil war. Greece's civil war was much more recent than the Spanish one, obviously. In Portugal, where the dictatorship, Salazar dictatorship, was not overthrown until 1974 by a collection of young army and Air Force men. Each of these countries, and certainly France, where the original right and left distinction was born during the French Revolution. In each of these countries, right and left mean different things, and they mean domestic things. I was surprised, and Russians might also be surprised to see, exactly as you pointed out, that Medvedev used the words liberal left. In other words, he used a slogan term, which is being used in the United States. Kirk's term was cultural Marxism, whatever that meant, and he had no conception of what Marxism meant, either as a history of Europe, as an economics of labor value and a conflict between labor and capital. No concept of economic Marxism, and certainly no concept of Marxism as a method for analyzing anything. No, the term cultural Marxism is now applied by Kirk to a range of things, and making the term Marxism synonymous with woke, and making the notion of left synonymous with woke and anti-traditional values, and so forth and so on. So the way the terms are being used and thrown around are propaganda terms, aiming to mobilize people's anger. Now, so I think it would be best if we don't try to settle on a definition of left or right outside of the particular countries we're in. You're in Brazil. Russia is where it is. Europe, each of the European states have had left-right conflicts in their recent history. But before we go too far away from each of those countries, I do need to remind everybody that since Kirk's assassination, President Trump, on his way to England, where he is today, made two statements in favor of killing people as a policy of the state, and killing them in part because they're either left or radical or opposed to the United States. On the September 14th, as he was preparing to fly not to England that day, he was asked whether he was in favor of, quotes, getting rid of Maduro, the president of Venezuela. And here's what Trump said in favor of killing assassination as state policy. We'll see what happens. If it's not an option or a not option, we'll see. In other words, he was implying support for killing the president of Venezuela as a policy of the state. Then asked about the attack in Qatar, which was aimed at assassinating the Hamas leadership, Trump said, well, my message is this. They, meaning Hamas, have to be very, very careful. Then it's not clear exactly what he meant by the they. They have to do something about Hamas. It seems he was talking about the Qataris and about the Israelis and about the US operations that were part of that attack. But Qatar has been a great ally to the United States. A lot of people don't know that. I told the emir, whom I think is a wonderful person, I said, you need better public relations because you don't really get the public relations, and so on. So Israel, I'm quoting Trump, and everybody else, we have to be careful. When we attack people, we have to be careful. Now, that's an extraordinary statement. When we attack people, we have to be careful. What does Trump mean? We have to be careful at not being caught. We have to be careful to achieve the kill. And that one failed. And he's basically admitting we messed up, the United States and the Israelis. Now, the left-right radical woke traditional versus woke culture. These are slogans in a propaganda war in which Kirk was a paid propagandist aimed at the young audience in the United States. We understand that left-right continues to be a label applied to Russians. On the other hand, you've just quoted him. Medvedev says, oh, no, we're not left, not anymore, not us. We're not communists. We're not left. We share your values in the United States. Therefore, let's come to agreement. So people are throwing these slogans at each other in a political meaning that has special meaning in each country.
John, because when we talk about left and right, we are talking about human being.
Yes.
I usually I don't live white or black. My whole life is somehow in a gray zone. It's not white, it's not black. And I think
Yes.
when it comes to the left and right, in each and every, here in Brazil, we have the same. And I cannot recognize myself to be part of the left, part of the right, but there's some issues with the left, there's some issues with the right, and we are always in the middle, somehow in a gray zone, dealing with the issues. But when it comes to the case of the left that they're talking about, Medvedev is talking about, in the United States, mostly the people, most experts on this podcast are talking about they're usually talking about the globalists, those people who are, I don't know how they can associate the globalists with the left wing, but somehow in their mind there is some sort of connection between the two. What's your take on that? How is it? Because I don't see that. In my opinion, that doesn't make sense. And these globalists are somehow, they don't have any party. They're not left, they're not right. They're somehow in the middle. They're using right and left in order to achieve their goals. Your take on that?
But that's a tall order. Two things. One is that it isn't Marxism it isn't either Marxist method or Marxist economic theory to describe US policy as imperialist and to discuss the history of empires, both present ones and past ones. What we often talk about on your program and what our colleagues talk about is the reach of US imperialism in all the forms it takes: military forms, corporate forms, and cultural forms. The use of force, the use of fraud as economic policy, extortion, intimidation, and stealing. Use of force, fraud, and subversion. Subversion is the use of propaganda in all its subtleties, whether it's Hollywood movies or whether it's the kind of woke attacks that and targeting and values that Kirk and others have gone on about for quite a long time. Globalization, I understand to be economic imperialism. And you have some talented economists, Michael Hudson and his colleague, I'm sorry, I suddenly forgot.
Richard Wolff.
Yes, Richard Wolff, who do an excellent job of analyzing the economics of the answer to your question. From my task here is to try to reflect how Russian thinking is, and it's rather hard to find the left in Russia at the moment. Yesterday, if people are interested, I did a piece on Dances with Bears analyzing the argument over the central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, and the policies that she's represented and which President Putin continues almost weekly to defend, to run the state with an interest rate that was 21% and was brought down this week to 17%. At that level of interest rate, the central bank is crushing the Russian economy. And it's widely understood. The Communist Party, however, the Communist Party, which if anyone was certified left in Russia, has very much softer, criticism of the central bank than the independent economists reflected in that article. All of them have been defeated in their campaigns to have President Putin remove or replace Elvira Nabiullina, the governor of the central bank since the year 2012-13. So if the left in Russia, that's the largest of the opposition factions in parliament, the Communist Party, is soft on the central bank interest rate, the meaning of left has lost its meaning in Russia, as an example. On the other hand, there's no shortage of, there is a Russian consensus about facing the imperialism the imperial war against Russia, but it's not often described in traditional left terms. It's described as Russia hating, as Russia phobia, as racism, rather than as imperialism trying to block the emergence of resistance, economic power, in resistance in Europe, resistance to the British Empire, resistance to the French Empire, resistance to the German Empire, and now the resistance to the US Empire. So the history of left and right in Russia since let's say 1917, it has its specificities and particularities, and that's the best I can do to explain how it's lost its meaning in as we forget the history, as people were born who don't recall even Communist Party rule. Left and right have lost their meaning in Russia.
John, you've mentioned the situation in the Middle East. We had the Arab Summit, and all the countries are coming together. You see Syria and Iran going to Doha.
Yes.
And what has happened? How do you see the gravity of what has happened in Doha, in Qatar? Qatar is different, is not Iran, Syria or Lebanon, even Turkey.
Yes.
They were somehow, the Turkey, even Erdogan was trying to use, at least verbally attacking Israel. But you didn't see that from Qatar and the leadership of Qatar. And Israel is attacking them. Donald Trump comes out, he says that there would be no further attacks. And Netanyahu, hours later, Netanyahu comes out and we're going to attack again and again until we get the target and we hit the target. How do they feel, in your opinion?
How do who feel?
How
Sorry.
the Arab states, Qataris, the people.
Good question. Difficult for me to answer. I spent several years as an advisor to the Arab League Secretary General. I think I used to know something about inter-Arab politics. And we wrote a book about American Power, Arab Revolt, which is still available, as a history of the destruction of Arab nationalism, secular Arab nationalism. Let me try to say a couple of things. First, in my view, the US was fully complicit in the attack on the Hamas leadership. I don't accept the paltry evidence that the Israeli aircraft fired missiles at the building. The experts that I've talked to say that there were only 2 or 3 flash detonations in the videos, and the damage on the front of the building is inconsistent with missiles coming in or rockets from the air, coming down diagonally or vertically. Instead, I believe the evidence, and the sources I have suggest the evidence, but this part's speculative, is that the attacks were launched by drones fired horizontally at the building from vehicles. And if they were vehicles firing, that meant they came into Qatar from abroad. And the most likely source of the vehicles was Israel, no doubt about it. The most likely transit was Al Udeid Air Base, the United States. And everything I've seen suggests that this was a US-Israeli operation from beginning to end. However, because it failed, and we just quoted Trump, because it failed, because, let's say, the planners weren't careful enough, because Hamas was not destroyed in the way that Hezbollah was in Beirut, or Haniyeh murdered in Iran, or Soleimani murdered in Baghdad, because the combination of Israeli-US power is failed in its target. Trump has to revert to improving public relations with those states, the sheikdoms, Qatar, UAE, Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, Bahrain, which have traditionally been threatened by secular Arab nationalism, but which have dominated the Arab League when it meets collectively. Without going into all of the inter-Arab conflicts and rivalries, may I say that facing a combination of Israel and the United States, Arab states which depend on US protection obviously have a doubt as to whether the US protection will be extended if Israel chooses to attack them. That doesn't encourage the so-called Abraham Accords formula that Trump pushed in his first term and is pushing again in his second term. There can't be a reconciliation between the wealthy sheikdoms and Israel, even if the US pushes. But there's a limit to the degree to which the sheikdoms can break up away independently. And the limits are set because of the long-standing conflict with Iran. So because the sheikdoms, because Arab nationalism's dead, because it's dead as Saddam Hussein is dead, it's because it's dead as Muammar Gaddafi is dead. There's no force in the Arab world for resistance to both the United States and Israel, and very limited capacity on the part of the Arab states to make peace, sufficient peace with Iran, that particular threat to the Arab leaderships would be smaller in their calculation than the threat from Israel. Unfortunately, despite all of the efforts, including the efforts of Russia and China to improve inter-Arab-Iranian relations, the Arab perception is that Iran is a bigger threat to their regime survival than Israel is. After all, did Israel attack? Qatari was killed in the attack, but it was not an attack, the Qataris understand, on Qatar. It was an attack on the Palestinians in Qatar. Therefore, do the Qataris, the Emiratis, do the Arabs, the wealthy Arab states, believe that Israel and the United States comprise a bigger enemy to their survival than Iran does? I think the answer is no, they don't. Until there's a serious fundamental rapprochement between Iran and the Arabs, it will always be the dominant force of Arab politics as it currently exists to seek protection from the United States. But this protection that the US offers to the Arabs, it always comes with a threat that if you don't behave, we'll hurt you. And Israel has always been a spear point in the US imperial control of the Middle East, as I see it. And the Iranian regimes since the Shah have failed to, overcome that problem. Saddam Hussein's war against Iran, war against Kuwait, intensified this conflict. The death of Gaddafi, though small, Libya being small, eliminated a voice for Arab unity and unification against the primary enemy. From a Gaddafi's point of view, it was always clear. The US first, then Israel. And Israel was always reviewed by Gaddafi as, and by Nasser before Gaddafi, Nasser of Egypt, and to some extent by Saddam Hussein of Iraq, and by some extent Hafez al-Assad of Syria, always understood that Israel was the weapon, the spear point of the US threat to the Arabs, which is continuing. So I don't see the response of the Qataris. I can't expect or anticipate an Arab League combination to change that. The only obvious Arab state or Arab group that has resolved conflict with Iran and focused against the United States and Israel are the Yemenis, are the Houthis. It's the one Arab force that represents the potential future that you asked about. But look how small, how isolated, how threatened, how continuously attacked by both the US and Israel and the British, how isolated they are. Do they get support from Qatar? No. The reverse. So I suppose the answer, the sad answer to your question, Nima, is the Houthis are the example of yes, it's possible for the Arabs and the Iranians to come to a fundamental alliance that assures their long-term independence. But look how small and isolated the Houthis are. Look how much on the defensive Iran is. Look how damaged Hezbollah is in Lebanon. These are the facts on the ground now. And the attack on Qatar is more interesting as a failure of US and Israeli power than it's an example of a change in Arab-Iranian alliance in future.
I think what has happened in the Middle East is amazing, John. Look at the war between Saudi Arabia and the United States on one side and Yemenis on the other side.
Yes.
You remember, in those days, the main enemy of the Arab states were Yemenis together with Iranians, because they thought that Iran is supporting Houthis to attack us and all of that. You know what has happened on October 7th, 2023 has changed everything, John. Has changed everything. Today's West Asia or Middle East is totally different from what it has been before the conflict started in Palestine.
Yes.
And you see all these countries coming together. They were on the path of normalizing their relationship with Israel. You remember that?
Yes. Yes.
It all has changed. And I don't know if that is appreciated in Washington or in Israel.
Well, I think what we've seen in the transformation in Israel is that for the first time, Israel and its entire Jewish diaspora believes that it can liquidate the Arabs, liquidate not just the leadership, the assassination of Arab leaders, or so-called terrorists, as the Israelis would call them, has been Israeli and American and French and British policy for more than a century now. However, liquidating all of the Arabs on a territory was not Israeli policy, active policy, until now. And as we speak, as our audience understands, the Israeli army is rolling into Gaza City. So the notion that the Israelis can more than displace the Arabs. Remember, we've talked on this program before that Franklin Delano Roosevelt offered a bribe to the Abdulaziz, the Sheikh or King of Saudi Arabia in 42, 43, when they met, a bribe to displace the Palestinians so that that Palestine would become a Jewish territory. That was US policy, not as Israel didn't exist at the time. There was resistance from Abdulaziz, but there was no concept at the time, except possibly in the Zionist writing and discussions, and then with the Stern Gang and the various forms of Israeli terrorism that evolved to throw the British out of Palestine. There was no concept of it would be necessary to kill the Arabs in order to rule them. It was more understood as a US-Israeli policy to assassinate their leaders. Bribe them is cheaper than killing them, but ultimately where we are now is those who've been murdered are Syria, are the result. We can see the results. Partitioned and broken Iraq, partitioned and broken Syria, partitioned and broken Lebanon. Do I have to go on and on? With just the Yemenis resisting and demonstrating the capacity to resist forever and inflict on Israel a cost that Israel in the long term, in a long war, can't bear, because ultimately it would depend on US financing, and that too will run out. So I think you're right, Nima. We passed the threshold of US-Israeli policy of replacing the Arab leadership so that those who were left would be subservient and serve US policies, give gifts to the bribery goes in the other direction now, right? Qatar provides a $400 million airplane as a gift to President Trump, compared to the bribe that Franklin Roosevelt offered Abdulaziz, a DC-10 Dakota, as I recall it, which was to be the first airplane that the Saudi Arabia ever had from 43 on. Actually, Abdulaziz turned down the gift. Trump accepted the gift. Now, the symbolism there should be clear to our audience. The Arabs paying for protection from a combination of Israel, which it thinks the US can control, and Iran, which those Arabs hope that the US will punish and penalize and drive into weakness. Everything's changed because Iran's survived the worst the Americans and the Israelis have thrown at them over the past 2 years. They've survived the worst that Saddam Hussein threw at them. They are much more resilient, and you know better than me. So that's a fundamental change. Iran has proved its resilience. The Arabs have not, except for the Houthis, except for Yemen. Russia's position has always been and continues to be to find accommodations between the weak Arab states, the strong Arab states, and Iran. It's always been integrationist. But to the extent that Israeli-American policy has been escalationist, Russian policy's been a failure.
Thank you so much, John, for being with us today. Great pleasure as always.
Thank you very much, Nima.